Uhuru Sasa, which means freedom now in Kiswahili. We just completed the Jazz Zone, and TN Providence did a tribute to Robert Nesta Marley. And joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, the author of about 50 books now, and his latest book is The Counter-Revolution of 1893, the Hawaiian Coup and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism, the South Pacific Basin, and Dr. Horne is basically a fixture on diasporic music, and I am going to let Melinda Francis ask the first question.
Do we want to start with Jesse Jackson?
We should. And before we do, let me make a prefatory comment that's been bugging me for some time, and I may have mentioned it before, but it bears repeating, which is that in light of recent events, the Davos Summit, for example, the Munich Security Conference, both of which we covered at length on this program, many of the erstwhile allies of U.S. imperialism, including Canadian imperialism, have come to the conclusion that Trumpism is not an aberration, it's not a temporary phenomenon, and that it's here for some time to come. Unfortunately, the U.S. left is not on the same page. And I understand why the U.S. left does not see Trumpism as an aberration, for example. Setting aside whether or not that's accurate, I guess they assume that if they see it as a permanent fixture, it complicates their organizing. But it seems to me, if you're organizing, you should know what you're up against. And I think that, unfortunately, and I know I've said this before, but it bears repeating as well, I don't think our Canadian friends, who are our next door neighbors, have done a very good job of analyzing the trajectory of U.S. imperialism. Of course, they're in high dudgeon, terribly upset about Mr. Trump claiming that Canada should become a 51st state, helping to goose separatist sentiments in Alberta so that it can become a territory and separate from Canada and then become a part of the United States of America. But it's one thing to be upset with what's happening today. It's quite another to trace the historical trajectory of how we got to that point. I think it's like a doctor seeking to make a diagnosis about lung cancer today without being aware that the patient has been going through 3 packs of cigarettes for decades, for example. And if there's one plea I will make to our Canadian friends, once again, is really to do a deeper dive with regard to the history of the United States and perhaps compare why the territories north of the border did not join the revolt against British rule in 1776, which Canadians see as a sort of demerit. I understand, given that fossil and parasite King Charles III is your head of state. But on the other hand, I don't think that we can go on this way with many of our friends on the left upset about today's United States while saluting yesterday's United States. That makes no sense. With regard to Jesse Louis Jackson, first of all, and perhaps you can dig this up while we're talking, I've heard his presentation with Cannonball Adderley Quintet from the Country Preacher album, I think it's called, and which of course is an homage to Jesse. Comes out decades ago. Jesse gives this speech about walking tall. It's quite enlightening and quite inspiring. But he passed away. He joined the ancestors after 84 strong years. A former comrade of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who moves from the Carolinas to Chicago to matriculate, and then becomes a leader in his own right, runs for president twice on the Democratic Party ticket in 84 and 88. He's an early champion of Palestinian rights, when you're in the vanguard on such a controversial question, you're bound to get arrows in your chest, which was the fate of Jesse Jackson. I would also say, as I told his son, Jesse Jackson Jr., on a program on KBLA, Tavis Smiley's station in Los Angeles, just on Friday, it might be online, I'm not really sure, that I trust and I hope that the members of the Jackson family will preserve his papers and deposit them in an archive so that they can be studied for generations to come. And I trust and I hope as well that the family and or a designee will file a Freedom of Information Act request with the FBI and the CIA to uncover documents pertaining to Reverend Jackson, because in order to take the full measure of the man and his movement, we have to know what he was up against. And these records from the FBI and the CIA might give us a smidgen of intelligence with regard to that potent point, because we know that many were upset with Jesse, as many refer to him by his forename, because he took on as an advisor the late, great Jack Odell, who had Communist Party ties and was also a militant within the National Maritime Union. You may recall that I wrote an entire book about the NMU. Jack plays a role. I collaborated with Jack on Pacifica Radio. But Jack also was an editor of Freedom Waves magazine, which I used to write for, now defunct. President Kennedy took Martin Luther King Jr. into the Rose Garden of the White House beyond the Oval Office, counseled Dr. King to get rid of Jack because of his communist ties. Dr. King agreed to do so, but maintained subterranean contact, which infuriated the U.S. ruling elite. The head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, the pugnacious, bulldog-like J. Edgar Hoover, called Dr. King one of the most notorious liars in the country as a result. And I would dare say that that refusing to toe the line helps to contribute to the environment that leads to Dr. King's assassination in 1968. But in many ways, Jesse inherited Jack from Dr. King. He was a key advisor, and particularly on these international forays into Cuba, on Palestinian rights, anti-apartheid activism, negotiating to retrieve U.S. nationals who had been detained in Syria, Lebanon, and former Yugoslavia, for example. So I would say with regard to Jesse Jackson, it's a life that is worthy of perusal, a life that is worthy of study. And like any human, including myself, and I presume yourselves as well, there were mistakes and errors alongst the way, which is inevitable in this rapidly changing society, in this rapidly changing world, where the authorities are conspiring against you, where there are what I call unpaid agents of the ruling class, that is to say, oftentimes ordinary people who are conspiring against you, something that I'm all too familiar with. So I think that Jesse understandably has been celebrated. Even King Charles III, your head of state, issued a statement in sympathy with the Jackson family. And I guess he's trying to deflect attention from the Andrew formerly known as Prince, who has been justifiably detained.
Jesse Louis Jackson was a 6'3". I guess he was about 200 something pounds. A brother who was a very charismatic. He was a great athlete. Played quarterback. I think he could have played. He may have been a major league baseball player had he he was drafted, I think, by some major league baseball team. But I heard an interview with Andrew Young, and he talked about how Jesse had Andrew Young had been up for hours and hours, needed some sleep, and he had met Jesse the first time, and Jesse told him that he would stand guard for him and let Andrew get some sleep. But he did mention the fact that Reverend Jesse, he said in kind of kind words that he had put it this way, he didn't have a self-image problem. He thought he didn't have a problem with his ego.
Well, I am somebody. I think that obviously you don't have to dig that far to understand that phenomenon. And excuse me if I practice amateur psychology. That is to say that he was born in Greenville, South Carolina, to a teenage mother. The father was a married next door neighbor who did not necessarily claim his son. And apparently that helped to contribute to some of the self-image questions that you are now raising. And of course, he was born with the surname, it wasn't Jackson. That was the surname he took on later when his mother remarried and the new spouse adopted the son. So I'm not sure if that's a materialist explanation of what Andrew Young is talking about, but it is something to contemplate.
The last thing I'll say about Reverend Jesse was he discovered a young man by the name of Ralph Johnson who became the lead singer of I think he replaced Leroy Hudson in the Impressions, and Leroy Hudson had replaced Curtis Mayfield. But Jesse Jackson was a great talent scout. He had a great he knew music, and he had a lot of talent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we played that Sonic song, after the song about Africa. He introduces that particular song, and I think Ilombe Brass and that crew, and I know Ilombe Brass was very fond of that song about South Africa. And Jesse, if you go through YouTube, you can see the video, and Jesse introduces that. But Melinda, let's go to the next question, my friend.
Yeah, I don't know. Before we get into Iran and Cuba, do we want to go to what's been on deck, Japan's election and the new head of U.S. Central Bank?
A new sermon, and the musician also tries to capture new things so that we might have melody and have rhythm as we do our things. We say every time that the most important thing of all is that no matter how dreary the situation is and how difficult it may be, that the storm really doesn't matter until the storm begins to get you down. My advice to you, message that the cannonball and the quintet brings to us, is that it's rough and tough in this ghetto. A lot of funny stuff going down, but you got to walk home. Walk home. Walk home.
Rough and tough in this ghetto. A lot of funny stuff is going down. Gotta walk tall. Walk tall. Walk tall. Rest in power, Jesse Louis Jackson. Now, with regard to the Japanese election, this is not good news for China. The fact that the current Prime Minister, Takaichi, received a mandate, a smashing victory. This is obviously good news for the Trump White House, because now they can pursue with more vigor their two-faced strategy towards China. Mr. Trump will be meeting with President Xi rather shortly. at the same time, he is boosting the hawkish Takaichi. And retrospectively, I've said this before, but it bears repeating, when Chairman Mao and the Chinese Communist Party cut that deal with Nixon 50-odd years ago on an anti-Soviet basis, I think that they could have cut a better deal, because obviously Taiwan was not part of that deal, and part of the contradiction right now between U.S. imperialism and China are these multi-billion-dollar arms deals to Taiwan, the rebel province China claims as its own. And obviously, Japan was not part of this deal. And now with Japan rearming with vigor, this is something that needs to be considered. Now, on the other hand, there are aspects of today's moment that will be beneficial to the People's Republic. I'm speaking of their good relations with South Korea, the engine of capitalism, second to Japan and that part of Asia. You're all familiar with LG and Hyundai and Kia, for example. And South Korea, like many on the Korean Peninsula generally, have a bone to pick with Tokyo because of their brutal colonial rule between 1910 and 1945. And then there's Chairman Kim in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. You know, they had their Workers' Party Congress just this past week. And Chairman Kim felt very confident, at least that was the essence and tenor of his remarks, to the thousands of delegates assembled. And that, in a sense, is good news for China, because Chairman Kim is bound to keep the Japanese hawks preoccupied, which means the Japanese hawks will have less time to focus on China.
You're listening to Diasporic music, and the situation with Iran is pretty dire, or is that an understatement?
Well, and I think that you were going to say a word or two about what I said last week based upon a report from National Public Radio in the United States, which said that in Toronto 7-8 days ago, there was a march of 400,000 under the banner of the late Shah and under the banner of regime change. And I was taken aback because all of the Iranians that I've met in Toronto have been rather progressive. And I think that you echoed that sentiment. But would you like to add a footnote before I say another word?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to add a brief footnote and let Melinda elaborate. There was a coalition of MAGA supporters, pro the Zionists, and I guess some sincere people, because it was projected that you had pictures of the Israeli flag, the U.S. flag, and the Canadian flag, and I think I'm right about saying that, but it wasn't as big as they claimed it was, and Melinda can go deeper than that.
Yeah, I was just saying that, like, when the media starts, naming how many people are in the streets, you kind of have to question, they're, for the last, 3 years, well, it's 2 years of the genocide, there's no reports on the amount of people that are in the streets, and all of a sudden they have, 250,000 people, out in support of, regime change, and most of the people there, they're waving the Shaw flag, and the thing is like, with the lack of political education, a lot of people don't even know the differentiation between that. So I would question, the numbers and where imperial forces are wanting to go. They want, regime change or they want intervention into Iran. So people should take those numbers and those figures with a grain of salt.
And let me say this.
Go ahead.
But I say this. Let me say, I used to take taxis, and the brother of the taxi driver would be from Iran, and I would be talking. We would be talking on the way to wherever I go. The fare might be $20, $30, and on more than one occasion, the people would tell me that we listen to you, and you have on Dr. Horne, and take the money, put it, give it to the station. That happened to me. That happened to me on many, many occasions. And you did an interview with quite a few interviews with the Iranian comrades when you were here, right?
That is correct. And I'm sure that they're alert to this fraught moment that we're facing with this major percentage of the U.S. Navy in a so-called armada, to use Mr. Trump's term, off the coast of Iran. The papers, the newspapers, and the media tell us that any moment now there will be a bombarding of Iran. But it's possible, and I underline possible, meaning not a certainty, that Mr. Trump may be getting cold feet and may be looking for a way to change the subject and move on, just like last year. He was going to get rid of the people we refer to as the Houthis in Yemen, Ansar Allah, and then he found out that they were so-called tough hombres and retreated and changed the subject. So now he's talking about releasing all the files on you, unidentified flying objects. For example, he's in a snit with the Supreme Court. He'll probably cause a controversy at the State of the Union address this coming Tuesday by singling them out. It wouldn't surprise me if Mr. Trump left the podium and goes down into the audience and socks the Supreme Court Justice Roberts in the face in order to create a diversion, for example. You can't put anything past this guy. After all, called that when he was a TV star, he used to appear in wrestling matches where he would throw chairs and get in combat with wrestlers and others. So, I mean, you can't put anything past this guy. And I think that part of the reason is that under Mr. Trump, the U.S. imperialists, they prefer these quick episodes, like a 12-day war in Iran, June 2025, where supposedly the U.S. obliterates the Iranian nuclear facilities in 45 minutes and then flies back home. Kidnapping of leadership in Caracas on January 3rd, 2026, leaving the party intact in Caracas, for example. The Iranians have made it clear that there's no such thing as some sort of performative bombing of Iran that will not be faced with a massive retaliation against U.S. facilities in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Iraq, not to mention the U.S. ally in Israel, for example. And Israel suffered grievously during the 12-day war of June 2025, which has not necessarily been highlighted by the U.S. press. And speaking of Israel, in this country, you run the risk of being canceled, to use the bourgeoisie's favorite verb, or losing your job or otherwise penalized if you suggest that Israel may have something to do with this aggression against Iran. And just as I issued a plea to our Canadian friends to do a deeper dive with regard to understanding the trajectory of the United States, it's not enough just to do a condemnation of what U.S. imperialism is doing today. We need to know how we arrived at this juncture. And likewise, I would say to many of our friends in the Jewish community, even those who are anti-Zionist, but since Israel purports to be the state of the Jewish people and that many of us get penalized and pulverized if we criticize the so-called state of the Jewish people, which means that Israel purports to be acting even in the name of those Jewish people who don't support Israel. We need a deeper dive with regard to how we arrived at this point. It's just not enough to do a condemnation of the current moment. We need to understand how we arrived at this current moment. We need to understand how and why it was, for example, that the Soviet Union and the communist parties globally, outside of the Arab world to be sure, supported the creation of Israel 1947, 1948. We need to understand how Zionism has impacted communist parties in North America, for example, which is not something that's necessarily been interrogated nor investigated. And I make a special plea in that regard. Now, back to the major thread. Turkey has good reason to believe that if Iran is attacked, or heaven forfend, there's regime change, that they're next on the hit list, despite the fact that they have a major military, despite the fact that they're part of NATO, supposedly an ally of the North Atlantic powers. But as many in Saudi Arabia are now claiming, Saudi Arabia of all places, that Israel is really sort of out of control right now. As Mr. Netanyahu himself once said in the last year or so, it's become a sort of combative Sparta that plans to redirect its economy towards military expenditure because they feel that they cannot necessarily depend on U.S. imperialism going forward, which I think is a wise bet, quite frankly, from the point of view of the ultra-Zionists. And speaking of ultra-Zionists, we're watching with alarm the attacks on the West Bank, for example. We noted with grave concern the fact that the U.S. ambassador, Mr. Huckabee, a former Fox News host and former governor of Arkansas, basically not only endorsed Israel's depredations in the West Bank, but said that they have the right under the Bible to expand further. We've had a rather horrible recrudescence of these religious sentiments, which, by the way, as I pointed out in a number of works, the conflict between Protestants and Catholics gave rise to English, then British settler colonialism on this continent. So we should view with grave concern these events in Iran, not to mention the rather intemperate remarks of the U.S. ambassador, Mr. Huckabee.
Well, we are in fundraising mode, and we would like, the last question, I guess, is we would like to ask you to tell our listeners why they should support diasporic music in particular and Black Power 96 generally.
Well, it's obvious. It's intuitively obvious to the most casual of observers that this particular program and the station in general provide news and views that you can use, news and views that are traditionally abused in other media organs. And so that's why I have no compunction about endorsing Black Power Media, diasporic music, and that's why I'm giving Comrade Linda the last word so she can tell us how to do so.
Yes, so if you haven't already, you could donate in multiple ways. If you want to do it online, it's blackpower96.org/DM. If you're analog, we do have phones open today. The number is 1-888-979-2796. Again, 1-888-979-2796. And if you are on stateside and you are on the Cash App, you can donate Black Power 96.
And with that, is Dr. Horne still here?
Of course.
I guess we'll holler at you. I know we will not be raising funds next week officially, But we'll definitely holler at you because I wanted to ask you about the black nationalists. How did the black nationalists, what their position was on the state of Israel? But we'll talk about that next week.
Right on.
All right. And I'd like to thank Lisa Watson for keeping us on track and making us sound good today. And I guess we had some mix up because people heard Cannonball Adderley preaching, the country
We
preacher.
state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.